Yeah, so it is a real pleasure to have Joshua Neves back here at UCSB. This is his alma mater, so to speak, now that we're virtual, I don't know, but it is, he's from the Film and Media Department here at UCSB, and his book, Underglobalization, was one of the books that came out during the pandemic from Duke University Press in 2020. So I was actually waiting to have him back physically in person to present on the book, but here we are again. This is a very richly compelling account of what he calls the underbelly of globalizing processes, or the sphere of disorientation, extra legality, and social endangerment, as he puts it, in Olympic era China. Josh is a professor at Concordia University in Montreal, and he directs the Global Emergent Media Lab. Beijing, in his book, is an emergent city, continually performing the fold of the ancient with the futuristic, hovering again in very timely ways and uncanny ways, again in our consciousness now as we listen to the talk. What Josh calls the speculative future of Winter 2020 Olympics is already upon us. And here we are in the media spectacle again that dazzles and equivocates, shimmers and fractures. So what better time than this to return to the bustling life of underglobalization? But you're here to hear from him. So over to you, Josh. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Bishnu and Jan and the Global Studies program for having me. It's really good to be back in California, although a bit comical to be now doing this from a sofa in a living room at the last moment. So give me just one moment to share my screen and bring up my slides. Oh, I need sorry, we didn't test this before, the screen sharing enabled, please. Thank you.
Yeah, it should work.
Okay, so can you see that okay? Great. So yeah, thanks again. It's good to be here. As Bishnu said, this book came out in March, or I think February 2020. So I gave, I think, 3 or 4 talks, and then very quickly things moved online. So it's nice to be back. And it's also good and interesting for me to be in a global studies context and to have the opportunity to draw out some of the book's arguments for this audience. Among its interventions, for example, is to put global, inter-Asian, and Southern perspectives into closer conversation with cinema and media studies, as well as critical social and political theories that see China as constitutive of rather than apart from global processes. And over the years, just to start with some kind of more ordinary examples, it's been interesting and often disorienting to trace that relationality between China and ideas about the global. So for instance, I recall applying for academic jobs a decade ago where a position in global media meant hiring someone who researched media outside of the US and Europe, right? A peculiar framing that located the global everywhere but here. On the other hand, more mainstream ideas about the global are very often synonymous with Americanization and its many cognates. This includes, for instance, the continued resonance of Cold War polarities and developmentalist framings that, like the World Trade Organization, use specific political economic criteria and policies to decide who is inside and who is outside of the world. And that kind of tension is one of the organizing, I think, kind of queries for the book. So more than a study of Beijing or China, then I often describe this project as centered on the jittery space between China and the global. It pays particular attention to what knowledge about China and Asia does in different places and in different times, including the ramifications of these ideas for engaging global futures. The most bald and familiar of these assumptions, perhaps, is the idea that China, among many other kind of presumed bad actors in the world system, basically threatens so-called Western democratic principles, free market values, and the benevolent infrastructures of globalization itself. And so, these kind of discourses of China's rise and China's fall, right, have been one of the many this has been captured over the last 20 or 30 years. So it is, in other words, widely seen as a dangerous or even a pirate state, a counterfeiter, imitator, faker, or spy. So under globalization then, which as Bishnu suggested at the outset, draws on my PhD work here at UC Santa Barbara, struggles to make sense of the complex and often contradictory understandings of China at work in scholarly and popular discourse. And it does so by shuttling between street level engagements with Beijing's media urbanism, so very pragmatic kind of site-specific practices around film and television and digital technologies, and larger questions about Asian or Southern globalizations. And in particular, the project aims to recalibrate understandings of piracy and the fake, which are critical to the reception of non-Western globalities, by resituating these practices within an emergent field of illegality that extends well beyond questions of media piracy or intellectual property theft, which is, I think, very often where those kinds of debates get stuck. Instead, illegality, from predictive policing to the migrant crisis, increasingly shadows popular politics today. This is to suggest that what national and international law, from state policy to the TRIPS agreement, identifies as illegal is not only potentially locally valid and valuable, but that public culture itself has become a kind of pirate relation. And in a basic sense, this is one of the real, I think, focuses across the book, to try to understand what it means to understand public culture as a pirate relation. Against widespread dismissals then and claims of faking globalization, the book charts how a wide range of social actors undermine or underperform, but also refuse to implement the specific procedures and protocols required by globalization at different scales. So one important ramification of this claim is the recognition that contemporary global dynamics are increasingly shaped by tensions between legality and legitimacy. And here I should nod to the great collection put together, I think, by your own Richard Falk and Mark Juergensmeyer on the topic. So taking up this friction, the friction between legality and legitimacy, Under Globalization asks, what happens when formal or legal contracts, both in China and as a global condition, what happens when formal or legal contracts, including things like rights, petitions, civil society, and citizenship, fail or become dangerous? And on what ground are new political relationships reclaimed and sustained? So my modest answer to this question is the workings of political society. And I'll say just a little bit about this conceptual framework coming out of the work of scholars like Partha Chatterjee, among others. So political society names the processes of social belonging where legitimacy matters more than legality, and where media practices and infrastructure become crucial to the performance of that legitimacy or sort of claim making. The concept, the book argues, has much to offer understandings of popular politics and political negotiation in China and globally, as it designates a sphere that meets few of the definitional requirements of democratic theory, and yet is where something like unfettered democracy, including its excesses, seems to actually be in action. The aim, as Chatterjee puts it, is to find ways to conceptualize the rest of society outside the domain of civil society. So, some of this comes from, among others of his works, right, the politics of the governed, where focusing especially in this period on the rural poor and on peasantry, Chatterjee focuses on first how this group both does not claim membership in political society and then must organize outside of this space in order to pressure governmental machinery by bending the rules, right? By kind of taking up something like piracy or a piratical relationship as a form of political practice, right? As a kind of form of popular politics. And the modest extension, I think, in the book is to extend this well beyond the peasant or the rural poor, right? To suggest that this is an increasingly an urban phenomenon, especially in the context of a place like China, where urbanization is indeed powered by massive influx of migrants into the city, but also to suggest it's become something like a global condition. So I call this vantage onto global media and translocal processes under globalization. Okay, so let me start then just by drawing a bit on the opening of the book. I'll kind of present one of the framing examples before talking a bit about the book's scope and its chapters, and then zooming in to look at a couple of examples. This has for a long time been one of my favorite ones. So in July 2007, Beijing TV aired a story about local food stalls that served steamed buns filled with fat-soaked cardboard instead of pork. The money-saving tactic caused an uproar in the city's media and was broadcast nationwide on China's central television, leading people to speculate about food safety and the everyday flavors of getting ahead in the capital. Shortly after the report aired, it was retracted by the station as itself a fake. The journalist Ze Beijia allegedly staged the story based on hearsay using migrant workers. He had hoped to boost the ratings of Degrees of Transparency, a program he produced for Beijing TV's Life channel. Soon after, Mr. Ze issued a formal apology and was arrested. The false story about the fake bun, however, did not go away. The media and passing conversations revealed a rampant belief that the fake bun was in fact real, that is actually filled with fatty pulp, and that the retraction, apology, and arrest were put on by government intervention. Unsavory practices that contributed to the negative made in China image, it was thought, would not be tolerated in the Olympic era, a period intrinsically linked to China's 21st century media urbanism. So this string of fakes then, or maybe more precisely uncertainties, underlines, I think, a host of issues related to media, development, and legitimacy in contemporary China, and indeed globally. In the very same week, for example, the former head of China's State Food and Drug Administration, Zheng Xiaoyu, was executed for accepting bribes to approve substandard and tainted medicine, and the proximate monks were equally marred by repeated controversies at home and abroad over things like poisonous infant formula, contaminated toothpaste, performance-enhancing drugs, human rights abuses, artificial rain, images of stubborn nail houses, campaigns against corruption and pornography, and confusion over the high steroid levels of Beijing's poultry. This latter fact hit the news as part of a campaign boasting that Olympic athletes would eat from a separate food supply chain. Residents wondered why their food was not fit for visitors. What troubles in this account is not that people modify food with cheap ingredients for economic advantage, or that information is manipulated and put to various ends, right? Such stories are overwhelmingly ordinary, but rather the fear that one's ability to discern paper food and bad news has somehow been diminished. The story about the alleged cardboard buns then is literally filled with this confusion, pointing to changing notions about how the state and citizens should act, the commercialization of media industries, and new discourses of illegitimacy that are irresolutely after socialism. These mushrooming experiences of disorientation, extra legality, and social endangerment are at the center of underglobalization, though it is often said to be something else entirely. And while these examples are specific to the People's Republic of China, this felt sense of uncertainty, I think, also extends across the continents, shored up by anxieties about fake news, failing ecologies, massive inequity, resurgent fascisms, neoliberal reasoning, and more. Put differently, illegitimacy as a marker of illegality, abnormality, and crisis is both a protocol and an outcome of globalizing processes. So while the mundane example of the cardboard bun privileges a key period in my own research for this book, especially the years framing the 2008 Olympic Games, the uncertainties it projects have only intensified in subsequent years. From stories about picture-perfect fake Apple stores, false reports of former Premier Jiang Zemin's death and resurgent red campaigns, to widely reported ghost cities, the fascination with detention of figures like Liu Xiaobo and Ai Weiwei, and salacious tales of corruption. The latter is perhaps best exemplified by the 2012 Bo Xilai scandal, including Bo's dismissal as Chongqing party chief and removal from the Politburo, and Gu Kailai's conviction for the murder of British businessman Neil Haywood. More close to the present, perhaps, it is the massive surveillance, detention, and indoctrination of Muslim minority Uyghurs in Xinjiang that frames this state opacity, what scholars like Darren Byler call terror capitalism. In this way, the cardboard baozi is emblematic of a new social mode where fake is broadly defined to conflate a wide range of social meanings and practices. Fakes are not genuine, they're second rate, they're harmful, and they're also punishable by arrest and execution, while at the same time offering a productive strategy to lower costs, increase ratings, or assert control over epistemological or social field, as with something like fake news. This emergent cultural, economic, and political logic, or perhaps rather illogic, extends far beyond the commonplace discussion of counterfeit goods and media piracy, is the focus of the book. It centers on struggles over legality and legitimacy and their deep embeddedness in the technologized city. During a period that I've called the Olympic era, right? Roughly spanning from Beijing's victorious Olympic bid in the late 90s and into 2001 to the 90th anniversary of the Communist Party in 2011, and into what during the writing of the book was a kind of speculative future of the Winter Olympics. So part of what's interesting for me to be back here talking about this now is, when I started this research in 2005, the Winter Olympics wasn't even an idea yet, but became part of, I think, the kind of master planning strategies that continue to define the kind of developmental telos that the project has looked at. And so in that regard, it's interesting to think about both what remains from the reception of the Summer Olympics some 14 years ago and what has changed, right? So of course, things like boycotts have remained quite central. Though, in the early reception of the Winter Olympics that's currently going on, which of course still has a couple more days, a lot of the news has focused on either the Xinjiang situation, right, with a Uyghur athlete being one asked to light the torch at the start of the games, quite controversially, or the kind of complex and confusing fascination with Chinese American athletes like Eileen Gu, right, at the expense of others, just to signal a few of the current fascination. So with this framing, I just want to talk through a few slides to kind of give you a sense of the larger picture of the book and then set up a few of its key questions. So the book is divided into 6 chapters and an introduction, and each of which explores kind of a particular entanglement between emergent technologies, urbanization processes, and popular politics. So the kind of the logic of the book is that it sort of slices into these questions differently at different moments. So to give you a bit more explicitly, of course, these are not the only focus of the chapters, or these are kind of the animating concerns. The first chapter really looks at planning's visual culture, especially the kind of development and relatively novel use of techno-scientific kind of planning strategies as a way to produce future logics. The second chapter looks at responses to that, the ways that a lot of citizens, activists, and especially filmmakers and artists develop and begin to think about ways of occupying this model city, kind of taking up the promise of this design rhetoric and relocating it and re-employing it. The third and the fourth chapter kind of work together as the second part of the book. Chapter 3 looks at tensions between formal and informal film cultures. So on the one hand, this is a period, especially in the first decade of the millennium, where independent and alternative kind of activist film cultures are really robust and growing in China, but they face a lot of new pressures from state regulation, from policing, and from the corporate sector, where China very quickly becomes the world leader in the number of cinemas and screens available internationally. The fourth chapter kind of takes up a similar logic and looks at tensions between state-run and kind of official television discourse and practices and more informal networks, the way that people use and situate themselves in relationship to these. And then the last chapters start to push some of these issues a bit more into let's say, larger regional and global dynamics. Chapter 5 looks at video politics and microelectronics labors, especially focusing on the use of video technologies by folks who make them in factory settings in southern China. And then the last chapter, which serves as the conclusion to the book, tries to return to a lot of these queries and to think about piracy as a social infrastructure, to think about people in this context as infrastructures, or to use one of Judith Butler's nice phrases, to think about piracy as a kind of social network of hands. And so here I'm interested in both pushing some of the claims about public culture as a pirate relation through the book, but also kind of reflecting on what it is that these dominant legal frameworks do in setting up the context. So with that sense of the larger book, let me just turn to a couple of alternate examples. So for a long time, I had even been calling this book Faking Globalization, kind of in homage, but also in response to a famous and very interesting essay by Akbar Abbas called Faking Globalization, which looks at Asian urbanism and the problem of the fake. And the essay itself is very interesting, and in the introduction of the book, I have a whole section taking up, some of its complex positions. But at the end of the day, what really fascinates me about Abbas's approach is that he seems to set a very clear threshold or limit on the value of something like faking or piracy, right? Faking for Abbas becomes a kind of symptom or a stage in development that, as he says, cannot be represented as kind of being capable of being politically subversive of the global order, right? So against these kind of larger debates within, I think, social and political theory, right, about the value of fakes and faking it, this project offers a different vantage. So one of the main suggestions, as I've already indicated, is to kind of move from fake things to the illegalization of sort of life and life worlds, right? So I think one of the problems that frames a lot of these debates is they're kind of, from the beginning, right, always already organized around the dominant discourses themselves. They're very much focused on IP kinds of concerns. And because of that, they miss, I think, the larger intersections that work across both illegality, but also geopolitical spaces. So this, again, is to focus on the tension between the legal and the legitimate, to think about pirate culture as a public relation, pirate relation, sorry, something that I develop in the book as illegal citizenship, and ultimately to suggest a move from something like global civil society, right, which has been a major area of focus in global studies related fields, to something like global political society, right, to suggest that the field has shifted to this space, and in fact probably had long been the case, but was not recognized as such for more epistemological reasons. The second point here is to emphasize the relationship between media technologies and urban processes, right? So one of the basic claims in the book is that media technologies and publicities become critical to making urban demands and to altering the way subjects are governed, right? And by doing this, one of the sort of simpler provocations in the book against, I think, North American-centric, European-centric new media studies is to draw out what often gets framed as the kind of underbelly of the digital, and to look at and to emphasize the aspects of new or digital or emergent media cultures that often get left out of idealized Euro-American configurations and big tech imaginaries. And then finally, underglobalization is also a way to start to think about some of the contemporary forms, or to examine or name some of the contemporary forms of underdevelopment itself, right, including responses to it, within a larger set of debates that have been going on for decades. And in fact, if there's time at the end, I may say a little bit about my next project, which kind of moves the terrain from focus on questions of underdevelopment, which I see as really crucial to this project, to taking up new questions of overdevelopment or of surplus as they get articulated through the current regime of new technologies. Okay, so keep getting my slide. My analysis of post-socialist come neoliberal media and developmental projects, as well as various responses to living in transformation, is not interested in reiterating the same old complaints against the Chinese state, especially not those that isolate China as a bad object in order to reinforce ideas about the Washington consensus or the munificent West, which is the kind of normative discourse and IR kind of politics in our own context. Or that advanced another argument in the genre, China will rise, right? China will fall. Instead, the book begins to theorize a larger process of underglobalization where ostensible democracies and autocracies are not only deeply enmeshed and collaborative, but shore up global platforms that require imitation, faking, technology transfer, et cetera, as the price of admission. So post-socialist globalization then works both by goading much of the world to copy its structures, and at the same time, perpetually belittling so-called developing nations for not copying right or the right things, for copying too much, or even for copying too well. In this sense, the critiques lodged against China in the book are not intended to be exceptional, right? That is not about China alone, but rather are emblematic, local textures in a global fabric. This is, of course, not to disregard the very real issues that the PRC poses for projects of social equity, ecological preservation, and democratic futures. But neither can these problems be taken apart from the global to which they are intimately tied. So instead, we need to return with renewed critical force to the deep failures, structural violence, and anti-democratic pulses that sustain and are sustained by the very idea of the West, including its imbrication with diverse forms of racial capitalism and neo-imperialism. And so one of the starting points for the book then is this basic acknowledgement of the role that hegemonic imitation and faking play within such processes, right? And what it means to respond to them. From harmonizing intellectual property regimes required by the World Trade Organization or the protocols of the World Bank, to exported models for productive consumer and debt-driven lifestyles. That these are widely understood to be practices of equality and progress give the lie to claims that copying and the informal economy are merely stages in development. Okay, so let me here then turn to a few examples from the second chapter of the book, exploring the relationship between official mediations of urban transformation, especially imminent domain like practices of demolition and reconstruction, which were so important in this period, and citizen activist and artist responses to such changes. And here I should note that I find it particularly useful to return to some of these examples now, precisely because so much has changed since 2005, 2010, or even 2015. Indeed, many of the examples explored across the book can be said to offer prehistories of the recent sort of platformization of everything related to the media economy, right? What the Brookings Institute terms China's country as platform policy, including things like super apps and express delivery, the rise of short video aesthetics and live streaming, and phenomenal technologies of surveillance and capture, and are also suggestive of what is missed when we look only at the most novel and high-tech aspects of digital culture. So with that, I thought we could start by looking at an old-fashioned state-funded documentary. So hopefully this, can you get the volume?
The games of the 29 Olympiads in 2008 are awarded to the city of Beijing.
那天没关，那样子放炮人都给崩了，连我们一住房的都给崩了，那天手都给崩了，一高兴。开奥运会啊，我们这重点呢，我们万里乡是占9平方公里呢，这是一个奥体公园。
奥林匹克公园呢，它的位置是在我们北京市市中心的北部地区，也是在我们城市中轴线的北端的地区。这个东面呢是我们现在正在评审的奥林匹克主体育场，就是国家体育场。
国家体育场、洼里乡，这2个看似毫不相干的名词，因为奥林匹克的缘分，在2002年被历史写进了同一个句子。作为一座承载着梦想的标志建筑，国家体育场的设计竞赛聚焦了无数的目光。与此同时，洼里乡3000多户居民也开始各自盘算搬迁的细节。
Okay, so shot over the course of 7 years, Dreamweavers Beijing 2008 is the official documentary of Beijing's Olympic transformation. The film opens with a series of stark juxtapositions, shifting from footage of elated crowds and dazzling fireworks to the rooftops of courtyard housing and the soon-to-be demolished Gao family home in Wali village. The matriarch, Gao Guilian, dutifully describes how her home will be razed to make way for the Olympic Green, one of nearly 4,000 displaced families to be relocated at that site. Another quick cut takes us to November 2002 and to design competitions at the Beijing Municipal Commission of Urban Planning, where global firms pitch their plans for Olympic venues. On the soundtrack, the clatter of shouting voices and fireworks gives way to the quiet haze and pigeon whistles of courtyard life, and finally to the official address of a planning conference. A government official describes the significance of locating the Olympic Park at the northern end of the city's traditional central axis. 3 minutes into the film, the voiceover montage exuberantly weaves these spatial and historical dynamics together, exclaiming the National Stadium and Wali Village have become synonymous. These juxtapositions succinctly capture the aesthetics of development undergirding new urban imaginaries, projecting the at once instant and deferred temporalities of modernization, old and new ways of living, ideologies of transition and sacrifice, and the importance of planning as a mode of address. The documentary continues in this fashion, cutting the Gao family's move to a modern high-rise apartment with scenes highlighting the construction of the Olympic stadia, training sequences featuring young gymnasts and the track star Liu Xiang, and preparations by special forces units charged with Olympic security. In each case, the hardship of training and transition are dramatized, but ultimately justified by the ends. The film, in fact, can be described as the official demolition and reconstruction story of Beijing, a documentary that directly responds to over 2 decades of disputes over redevelopment, unfair compensation, corruption, and massive changes in quality of life, including 30-odd very well-known documentary features that focus on this explicit topic. So what interests me about this polished and moving documentary is not its propagandistic tone, such patriotic developmentalism is typical around the world, but rather how it seeks to establish legitimate modes for living out urbanization and dispossession. This includes the promise of new roadways, subway lines, high-speed railways, airport terminals, new megastructures like the National Stadium or the National Center for the Performing Arts, as well as housing, shopping districts, and telecommunication infrastructures. But it also projects an ideal citizen, modeling how subjects should act, relate to the state, and articulate their aspirations. This includes paternalistic relationships with district governments, expectations about consumption and lifestyle, and civil or resilient responses from those asked to forego, improve, or migrate. The Gao family relocation is presented as an ideal template for the difficult but necessary changes shored up by urbanization. Tellingly, in the documentary, they're also presented around a generational gap between Grandma Gao and her children. And the gap takes the familiar peasant versus urbanite trope, where urban subjects are associated with quality and the future, and rural people are subject to improvement. While resigned to another massive change, Grandma Gao also speaks quite frankly, even crying in a few scenes, as she worries over leaving her family home and moving to the city. But the family's not really moving to the city so much as the village is being swallowed by its expansion. The Gaos will move a short distance to a new development and watch as their home is remade into a high-tech Olympic green and stage for global media spectacle. In contrast to Grandma Gao's seen this before acquiescence, her son and daughter-in-law are exuberant about the possibility for a new life. This idealism is framed by the birth of their daughter Tong Tong on New Year's Eve 2002. But while excited about leaving the countryside for the city, the young family are also quite anxious about the complexities of relocation. In one scene, for example, they imagine the cost of buying a new apartment, 130 square meters at 4,000 renminbi per square meter, more than 500,000 yuan, and worry whether government compensation will be sufficient. This anxiety is presented in a moving sequence just minutes later, showing the family seated around the table during the 2003 Spring Festival. As China Central Television's broadcast of the New Year's Gala plays in the background, the extended family both celebrate the passing of another year and express trepidation about where the next one will find them. The film also takes care to explore detailed differences between the Gao family home in Wali village and the family's new home in the city. So there should have been an image of the new apartment here, but it seems to be missing. But imagine a fancy new high-rise tower in Beijing, and I think you have the picture. So the film also takes care to explore detailed differences between the Gao family home in Wali village and the family's new home in the city. For example, in the opening sequences, the camera dwells on the dilapidated state of the old courtyard-style home, its primitive kitchen with a coal stove, separated living spaces, and Grandma Gao's shuttling of a bucket of water. When 4 years later, we catch up with the family at Little Tong Tong's kindergarten and near the Bird's Nest Stadium, and next in their new apartment, the viewer is struck by their lifestyle change. The village courtyard has been replaced by a small, bright apartment in a high-rise complex, complete with an air conditioner, gas stove, and other conveniences. One of the film's producers greets Grandma Gao by telling her that she looks much younger than last time. And indeed she does. She wears new clothes, has a fashionable haircut, and even her teeth, the subject of earlier close-ups and marker of her peasant status, have been replaced, right now white and sparkly. She enthusiastically states that life is much better in the village and now she has fewer worries. She even adds with pride that each of her 3 sons now owns a car. Importantly, the processes of compensating the Gao family for their home in Wali village and of finding and purchasing a new apartment are all but elided in the documentary. A single scene of a government official posting the terms of relocation, followed by friendly officials carefully measuring the dimensions of Gao's residence, are all we learn about the process. But this elision is significant precisely because the process of demolition and relocation has been and remains intensely controversial across China. This is both because of the traumatic scale of redevelopment, but also because its specious protocols have spurred petitions and protests, mass sit-ins, traffic blockages, suicides, and violence. Contentious modernization projects draw our attention to widespread land grabs, speculation, fraud, and illegal government actions that are important to Beijing's transformation in the 2000s, but that also continue in the capital and nationally. The 2011 and 2016 anti-corruption protests in Wuhan, Guangdong, or the November crackdown and massive arrests of migrant communities in the Beijing, November 2017 crackdown and massive arrests of migrant communities in the Beijing suburbs are just 2 of many well-documented illustrations of this ongoing dynamic. Dreamweavers then, alongside a wide array of official designs and discourses, refuses the ambivalent and violently unjust aspects of redevelopment. While there is no doubt that new infrastructure and urban renewal projects have improved living standards for many people, the reverse is also true. These modernization projects should be understood in relation to the widespread dispossession and disenfranchisement, including China's massive floating population, some 250 million workers, frequent protests, burgeoning income gaps, environmental devastations, and so on. In short, they articulate new urban lifestyles and citizenship practices. That this telos of development is seen as the solution to poverty, vulnerability, and social abandonment, and not one of its underlying causes, is crucial to the focus of underglobalization. Put differently, Dreamweavers projects an official modality of development that relegates people to a life aesthetic defined by the state so that they can become citizens. Other forms of social and political life in this context fall away as illegal, counterfeit, backwards, and so on. But such processes of media urbanism capture both the agility of the state as well as new capacities in public culture, including a wide range of media practices that take up this basic idea, repeated endlessly in and about the city, that social forms are mutable and can be re-engineered to feel and to work differently. So here, for time, I'll just talk through a couple of other projects I've been interested in, and there are many, and then I'll look at another example and start to wrap up. So again, documentary responses to these cultures and practices of dispossession are manifold. There are dozens of such films and photography projects. One of the most influential, perhaps, is Oning and Cao Fei's 2006 film Meisher Street, which is set in a district south of Tiananmen Square. And the directors work with a resident in the area. They give him a camera, and he actually shoots most of the film and is the voice and the commentator in the project. And part of, I think, what's so fascinating about this work is the way it plays with both legal norms. So it's constantly inciting legal regulations in the city, the Chinese constitution, and other sort of promises, and a lot of the kind of handmade signs here gesture to that, and also documenting these. So it manages in a very interesting way to turn the kind of facade of a building, right, the street level experience in this neighborhood, into kind of a micro media event that plays out over a couple of years, and finally results in what is an unusual outcome, in that Zhang gets his housing replaced at a fair cost for the same neighborhood. Because among the many concerns here, including a lot of folks who are dispossession have to leave the area totally, is that people who had desirable housing in the center of the city, right, in neighborhoods surrounded by their friends and their kind of habitual ways of living, are moved, miles away to suburb housing and high rises and totally disconnected. So these are common discourses. So the films like this are one, I think, important and interesting response that speak to the way that folks are responding to such practices. Another one of my favorite example comes from an architecture company called MAD, which has a number of great interventions, but this one is a conceptual project, so never built, but to turn Tiananmen Square into a park, right? The idea is to turn this concrete semiotic space, most widely associated with the Chinese state, into a park that mirrors the images, right? All of these green, kind of techno-verdant futures that populate the renderings of the future city, right? And what's interesting about this is examples like this would have been widely displayed in the city, right, in galleries and at shows, on t-shirts and so forth, but start to become part of the play and the popular discourse with techno-scientific planning itself, right? They kind of enter into the public cultural debate about these changes. Another one of my favorite projects from the time, and indeed the cover of the books comes from this series, is from an artist by the name of Xingdan Wen, who started this project which she worked on for nearly a decade called urban fiction. And what she would do is go to real estate companies, or sometimes even state companies managing new developments, and take photographs of the models or maquettes that were used in these sites, And then she would bring these digital images home and she would create stories in them, right? She would take images of herself and insert her into these spaces in order to kind of breathe some life into them, precisely because the models are so empty of human life, right? And one of the, I think the arguments here has to do with the way that planning and model culture evacuates the present, either by connecting it to some sense of a changeless heritage or kind of attaching it to the future, right? But in so doing, evacuates the present. So this is the image from the cover of the book, although in a much close-up on the book, that shows her, you can barely see it perhaps, standing on the edge of one of the buildings, right? One of the things she says about the project, I think is very resonant with the kind of popular politics that I'm trying to think about here, is that the models of these new living spaces are perfect, clean, and beautiful, but they are also so empty and detached of human drama. When you take these models and begin to add real life, right, even a single drop of it, so much changes. Okay, so a more recent example then is perhaps the work of the anonymous microblogger E2 Man, who was active in Beijing from around 2010 to 2015. Dressed in the silvery pop costume of an extraterrestrial, E2 Man photographed himself at a wide range of sites across the capital, posting images tinted with vintage filters and often directly addressing the camera. One online story covering E2 Man's rise opened, "How would an alien comprehend everyday life in Beijing?" Another netizen interprets his foray as an attempt to, quote, "better understand Earth culture." While speculation as to the blogger's identity and purpose ran wild in the comments sections, noting everything from performance art to activism to stealth marketing, the images of E2 Man also directly engage the uncertain politics of inhabiting the city that I've been tracing here. E2 Man's Weibo posts, for example, capture an alien figure walking through demolition sites, at the dump, in an abandoned amusement park, shopping in trendy boutiques, eating in restaurants, and standing in traffic. Another shows him in relative close-up, pointing to listings in the window of a real estate office, presumably confused or angry about skyrocketing housing prices. E2's urban forays insist not only on traumatic changes in the material world, but also how these shifts transform even local and long-time residents into aliens or outsiders. Thus, the question is not only how an alien would understand Beijing, but how the city regards, creates, and even requires such forms of life. The figure of the citizen alien, both as a visual cue and a form of iconic difference, flips the relation between foreground and background that predominates in images of the future city. Instead of looking at the city itself as a subject, right, its famous structures or beautifully rendered panoramas, it's the extraterrestrial who gazes out from the photograph. From urban fictions to E2 Man, these widely circulated examples refuse the logic of the empty, deferred, or pedagogical city. In particular, they ask what it means to inhabit a plan, a model, or a blueprint. And just as Chinese visual culture in the 1990s and into the 2000s was concerned with the problem of living in a city in ruins, right, during this kind of demolition phase, and of maintaining cognitive maps of spaces that disappear at the speed of a shutter, so too cultural production in the first decades of the millennium examined the politics of transitional spaces, including the many newly erected buildings and neighborhoods that have yet to be made into meaningful and livable sites, right, without human drama, as Singh puts it. In bringing together these aspects of Beijing's media urbanism circa 2008, the brief talk then is sought to create a snapshot of the city's media sensorium at a crucial moment of transition. One of my basic arguments is that occupying the developmental city, where media now play a central role in shaping the ways that it's inhabited, has transformed citizenship and non-citizenship practices in important ways. these can be reduced neither to the command logic of post-socialist governance, nor to the democratic reforms associated with the rule of law or the Chinese constitution. Instead, what I paradoxically term illegal citizenship throughout the study helps us to understand the social projects and forms of urban belonging enacted by claims on the city's media technologies and infrastructures, including how informal and illicit practices pressure or transform official structures themselves. What matters here is how people make claims on cities and citizenship from positions that shift between or outside the domain of rights, civil society, and the law. How that is, they direct the promise of legitimacy towards themselves. This is also to underscore one of the chief claims I make in the book, which is that it is the enforced imitation and implementation of developmental and legal norms, and not their make-do inhabitations, that constitute the crucial problem of the fake and of underglobalization. So just to quickly end then, if I may, I thought I would point to a talk that we're actually hosting next week that I think builds on this research. It's on Zoom with Darren Byler. He's going to talk about his excellent new book, Terror Capitalism. This is on February 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And so if you go to the Global Emergent Media Lab, you'll find the registration information. But this is very clearly a kind of image that almost maps exactly onto some of the problems I've been talking about. And I think updates in some ways the local and subnational relationalities that are kind of producing global processes in that context at the moment. And then the last thing I would gesture to is, over the last, 5 or 8 years working on this and related projects, one of the real through lines in my research has focused on, I think, problems of underdevelopment and underglobalization. But building on this, my research program over the 5 years or so has kind of shifted to focus on what I'm thinking about as the rise of overdevelopment as one of the core models and political challenges of the present. So overdevelopment then is not merely a kind of excess of development, but rather a paradigm whereby exploitation and aspiration are transformed by global media processes, including new biotechnologies, which is one of the areas that I'm looking at. So this includes, for example, new modes of surplus generation that scholars like Melinda Cooper have called surplus life, or activists like Vandana Shiva called biopiracy, to describe how this bioeconomy produces by depotentializing future states. So it's to say that with a similar focus on kind of what gets left out of new technological habitus, or what gets kind of occluded by the dominant imperatives around new media technologies, the aim is to turn attention towards larger relationships between things like the platform economy and the pharmaceutical industry. So I've just finished a short book that takes up this kind of question, just to sort of chart a through line that will be out in June, and is collaboratively written with Alina Chia, Susanna Pasonen, and Ravi Sundaram. So with that, thank you. So great to be here, and I hope I haven't spoken too long, as I know Zoom can be a bit innovative.
Thank you, Josh. That was an amazing trek through underdevelopment to overdevelopment. And there's lots to digest. And I see a lot of people here with a lot of expertise to ask you questions. So if you can either say stack or tell me in the chat, or put your hand up. Naoki, okay, you take the floor, Naoki.
Hi, Josh. Thank you for a great talk. So I have a question about like your main theme, behind, your book, which is, faking or pirating globalization. And then, of course, well, this term reminds me of like, kind of previous version of faking, which is, of course, faking modernization, especially, in the context of, non-Western cultures, non-Western countries. So then first question is, what's actually the kind of difference between, faking globalization and faking modernization, in addition to the obvious kind of temporal difference between these two moments, that's the first question. And then the second is, as a lot of, post-colonial scholars already, have, kind of tried to elaborate, some concepts to talk about, non-Western modernization, productively, for example, like concept of alternative modalities. And then, but at the same time, there are also many scholars, who are really critical of those concepts, like, Jameson. Jameson, as was always critical of the concept of alternative modalities. And then for him, Jameson, socialism was actually the, if there's anything that we can call alternative modality, then socialism should be that. Then that's why my question is then how actually China's socialist past was still like continuation affected, this kind of practice of faking globalization. One thing, that comes to my mind is socialist realism, because that's actually using fiction, obviously, to actually achieve, some kind of propagandistic kind of purposes. Well, we can think of, land ownership in China, because, as like in China, people cannot really own the land. It's a kind of faked, contract, right? Because, they cannot really extend, that ownership to, next generations in general. So it's a kind of they are playing, of course, real estate market, but it's based on some kind of faked sanction or faked contract in a sense. That's also a legacy of socialism, right? Of course, it has both advantages and disadvantages. So what do you think of, this faking or, pirating globalization in conjunction with China's socialist past? That's my second question. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting, and obviously a lot packed into those questions. I mean, so first, I think most basically, the project kind of reacts against, I think, the developmentalist idea of faking globalization, right? That this is common in, it's in Abbas's essay, and it's certainly in a lot of the IR literature, where this is like a stage you pass through en route to, right, the desirable, fully developed member of the World Trade Organization, et cetera, kind of position that undergirds these kind of issues. So one of the things is to pump the brakes on that and to kind of refuse that model, and to ask what it would actually mean to take faking more seriously as a problem in social theory and political theory. So one of the things that fascinates me, for instance, is in the dozen books on piracy and the fake that I love, they all do this in one way or another, right? They're kind of fascinated by the potentialities of the fake, but they get to a point where they set up a very clear threshold, after which it no longer is a significant political, kind of category. That I think is, I mean, there are good reasons for that. And there's a lot of things to say there. And there's a lot of debates and literature I get into in the book about this. But it does also cover over, I think, a number of things. Among them is the fact that a lot of this kind of discourse starts out from a set of issues that already kind of frame it as a losing kind of battle, right? So that's why I think, in a very simplistic terms, shifting from fake property, right, from fake production, from this kind of register, IP, media, and so forth, which really overwhelms all of this discussion, to thinking about what is a widely recognizable, right, as a condition of illegality, right, that is not specific to the global South, right, that is not specific to certain areas in the way these problems are often situated or racialized or whatever, but is a global condition, right? What would it then mean to, so this is a very modest, specific, obviously it emerges from a media studies set of concerns kind of project, but that tries to push against that. So there's so many other questions that the only other thing I'll say, and the rest of this is maybe, for another conversation, but is of course, some of the most interesting work that makes China a more complex example in this context is always stressing that China's even, economic power now totally emerges from successes of the socialist past, right? Education and literacy and healthcare and all of these things. People like Lin Chun and many others have written, very interesting about this, and it's a big part of it. I think what gets missing in at least the kind of knee-jerk debates, either from kind of IR contexts or from just contexts that take the New York Times view of China, is to constantly position it as outside of global processes rather than as basically entangled with it, right? And so all of the things you're suggesting, the point is, what does it mean to think about global emergence, global dynamics, processual kinds of problems when we're starting from that relationship where China is a prime mover, right? And not this thing we're trying to manage, right? Like I think of political science books from a decade ago, like Edward Steinfeld's like Playing Our Game, where we're supposed to make the rules of globalization such that China can never get in here and mess it up, right? That's a very strange and normative logic in this context. Anyways, yeah thanks, Neves.
So we have several questions in line, Josh. We have one from Mark, and then David, who's going to ask in person, and then Kim.
Is that me, Marcus?
Marcus, sorry, Marcus.
Thank you so much. Wow, there's so much wonderful things to digest. I thought it was a fascinating concept when you said piracy as a social infrastructure. What now is specific to China and what represents a more general dynamic? Could you comment perhaps a bit on the historical contrast of intellectual property in China and the West? In the West, intellectual property had long been an imposed regime, but in China, a proverb can claim that it's a noble offense to steal a book that in, let's say, German or some European culture would be hard to see so celebrated. In contrast to underglobalization, how do you see the potential for globalization from below? What if the actors from the global South and elsewhere band together to topple the existing intellectual property rights regime and replace it with one oriented more to equal and open access? So I guess there are two questions here that are somewhat entangled.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. That's great. And obviously these are both massive questions. I mean, I can say, so my own focus on piracy as a social infrastructure here starts from the kind of granular, right? So it starts from especially, let's say, like hand-to-hand selling of things like VCDs on the street, right? And very particular gray market kinds of economies that were the norm, certainly in places like Beijing and throughout China in the period that I'm looking at, as well as many other places, right? So that's a specific condition of emergence, but it's also a particular relationship to, I think, a legal regime that, regardless of the history, sure, there's a different history of copyright, starting in England and so forth, and lots of scholars, Adrian Johns and others have traced some of this. That has a long impact. But I think because this is the period where the internet is becoming a mass medium and smartphones are entering our pockets and all of these things, all of those questions are so basically reframed that, of course, they remain significant, but it's really a moment where I think everybody, right, not just in China or in other places, right, it's not just this kind of technical survival sector piracy that matters, but everybody is rethinking relationship to cultural objects in new ways. And there's a lot of energy, right? Academics, activists, all kinds of folks, right? Even popular culture, right? Music sharing and all of this. So I think that's an important moment. It's a horizon where a lot of things are changing. And, of the shift from socialist era, ideas of property to this is, of course, radical and happening very quickly. So, but I think that's what makes some of the logics, which I think are global conditions, come into view so clearly, right? The kinds of things that we tend not to see in our own context because they were just the water in the fishbowl can be seen so clearly when you see them smashed onto a context as forms of regulation over a short period of time, right? Because you've signed a new treaty or an economic treaty, or because you're preparing a city to be on camera for a year for a global media spectacle or something like that. So some of these tensions, I think, bubble up in that context. In terms of the globalization from below kind of debates, I mean, I'm obviously interested in these, and in a lot of ways, it's what the book is doing. I don't know if it's, I'm of two minds whether the the focus on illegality as the normative condition of life is a cynical or a hopeful response to that question. On different days, I have kind of different thoughts about it. But I do think shifting, for me at least, that analytical shift is significant, partially because it also moves beyond the geographic idea of the global South, right? And instead makes us look at everywhere we are in that more fractal sense, right? So Santa Barbara as one of the wealthiest and one of the poorest places in the same place at the same time, right? That's a model of why the South matters. That's very different. And that underlines, I think, why illegality as a habitus matters, at least for me. So those are tiny answers to your big questions, but I really appreciate it.
Yes, David?
Bishnu, thank you. Thank you, Bishnu, so much. Joshua, my goodness, this is just stunning. I'm really keen to get the book. And I was reflecting on the stark contrast of when I first visited Beijing in 1983, as it was coming out of the Cultural Revolution, to today. And yet not much has changed really in behind the scenes. Baudrillard talks about how our current society has replaced all reality and meaning with symbols and signs, and then human experience is a simulation of reality. I'm really interested in further commentary from you on the roles of media in all this. And I love your pirates references. Pirates and gangsters need a lot more attention, I think, in our current discourse. And Ai Weiwei has tried to pull us all in this direction. And I'm also keen, I'm sorry, I'm asking too much, but I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the current Winter Olympics. And then, of course, the Tokyo Olympics contrasts with that so interestingly. And then the Super Bowl we just had. So sorry, I just went after a lot of things there, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's great. I mean, things to think with. It's funny because my interest even in the Beijing Olympics was always like, it started, 8 years before the Olympics and extended way after it. So it was a stretching, right? A long durée of eventfulness. Like, I think one of the things the project has kind of resisted is taking the 90-minute or 2-week spectacle or whatever it is as the object, and instead, tracing it to how it actually shows up in everyday life and everyday practices over a longer period of time. So that's to say that even when I was doing this, and I was in Beijing in 2008, I think I went to 50 events or something, so I have the sense of the games, but I was never actually that interested in the game. It was never about that part itself. I was much more interested in the kind of the fantasy structure, right, attached to these kinds of massive political, economic performances, and the way that media, came to take new roles in them. So, even I think my original interest, again, my PhD's in, film studies, so started as a much more filmy project, and then I got to Beijing for a couple of years to do field work, and none of that seemed to matter. All the stuff that was interesting to me was the stuff I was encountering every day in the city, and that no one was talking about, and that certainly didn't constitute like new media, right, in any traditional sense. So, I found myself talking a lot about these vinyl printed construction site scaffolding wraps that were used to cover demolition sites, or, the resurgence of hand painted signs as they're captured by photographs and then put on the internet, right? Like really different kinds of constellations for thinking about, the role of these technologies and how political practices can jump infrastructures and kind of geopolitical space in all sorts of interesting ways. So, to come back then to the events themselves, I don't know how much I have to say, other than that I'm always very fascinated by almost the reception of them more than the address itself, right? Because again, for me, the address has been so much elongated that, it's very interesting to see how, for instance, US pundits view the meanings of an Olympic ceremony at a given moment. I feel like I learn more about understandings of China and the political system at a certain moment because of that than I do about anything else, right? So, the 2008 ceremony was fascinating because people were both they were fascinated and horrified by all the synchronization, but they were also so angry about things that seemed so trivial, right? The lip syncing of a young girl during the performance, which is standard, right, in these kind of things. The CGI of fireworks during the final, you know, these little things, like they become, I think, runes of a very fascinating problem. So anyways, I didn't quite answer your question, but
no, you got onto it. I would love to hear more. I'd also like to hear Jan's comments on your work. So sorry. Okay,
yes,
I'm sorry.
He's in queue. So Kim, Jan, and then Soha.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Joshua, great presentation. Thank you. But I'm going to come from this at a very different angle in that I've never even been to China. Okay, I know very little, although I've had a long interest in China, but I've never been there, or so I haven't experienced it. But I think the response that I had that came up through this, and Marcos touched on it. I was hoping you'd go a little further, but I want to take it further. And I think our conceptualization of globalization has to be expanded. I think this idea of both a top-down and a bottom-up globalization is terribly important. When you look at the amount of protest around the world, in China as well as elsewhere, that has happened since the mid-1980s, it's been phenomenal, the changes that we've seen. We've seen hundreds of millions, if not billions of people in the streets and or in electoral processes repudiating the status quo and where our leaders are wanting to take us and stuff. So I'm just wondering if you might have thought of, I mean, you talk, as I understood it, some of the things you were talking about are in resistance to the government projects, but I'm just wondering if it might be more than that, in that people are repudiating some form of industrial civilization even. And I think that we see this coming up in the environment, the protests against environmental devastation, climate change, and things like this, where people around the world are saying the costs of this top-down globalization are too extreme, and that we need to think how it's going to affect ordinary people. So, I mean, there's a lot there, but I just thought I'd bring that in. I think it needs to be in there, and I think that might be a more fruitful way to look at some of this stuff. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. Obviously, I've pulled out little bits for the talk, but I think one of the things that's interesting about looking at something like Olympic development is precisely its modularity, right? So if one of my points is trying to be that this is not a process specific to China, precisely because we could trace similar dynamics around the world, I'm hoping that that example is a good way to suggest its globalness, right? Its transportability, even though of course it's localized in lots of contexts. So in that sense, even though yeah, I am interested in problems around dispossession and homelessness and migration and all of these things, which I think see as often produced by the things that claim to protect it. These are not complaints that are specific to China. Again, that I think that's, I think at least part of the point for me, that this logic is transposable and speaks to contemporary political economy and contemporary aspirations in pretty significant ways. The faking part for me, it also responds to one of the dynamics that you're talking about, which is that certainly in China, the regularization of social protests has only increased each year since the 80s. You're certainly right about that. You know, a lot of scholars also trace even the increase of unionization kinds of issues, right? Mm-hmm. There's a sociologist that has a great book that I use a bit in the book because I think it conceptualizes this usefully, that talks about it as contentious authoritarianism, right? The regularized, right? The normalizing utility of social protest in a context. What interests me though, and this is where I think at least the kind of piratical faking, et cetera, lens is kind of a different way to slice into the problem, okay, is that the starting point in a lot of the examples I'm looking at is not one where you come with rights, right? You don't necessarily come as citizen or with someone who has a legal claim, right? And this, you know, for Chatterjee, he has a bunch of his own side projects, but he's very interested in precisely how people use kind of other sorts of affective and moral claims, right, in order to make the legal structures bend to do basic things, right? Give a squatter community garbage pickup, right? Things like this. So thinking with that kind of insight for me then becomes a way to ask or to connect with popular politics more broadly. What if it means if more and more of us, and certainly this is a recognizable condition, you know, when we look at the global challenges that are most visible, right, in popular discourse. But what happens when that becomes the normative structure, right? We've so, especially in, you know, North America and Europe and other places, we've so fantasized, I think, about like civil society kind of logics and, you know, rights-based kind of claims, whether it's citizenship or human rights, that I think we miss maybe this other dynamic becoming more infrastructural to global politics, right?
All right, now this what you're just saying is I wish you brought out a little bit more in your talk, because this is stuff I think is real important, and that it's not just localized to China. You're absolutely right, but that it's going around and people are getting involved in ways that I don't think we've ever seen before, and there's something going on, and I think now the idea, like your film of showing how what happened when the Olympic Stadium was built and stuff, and the Wali Village was moved out, I think that's fascinating stuff. And now you're getting into stuff that I think is important. But I think that larger conceptualization of not under globalization, but globalization from below. In other words, a view of globalization based on totally different values than that top-down corporate militarist globalization that we have around the world. I think that's the important thing. It spans the so-called global South, global North debate, because it's happening in the US and Canada, as well as Europe and Japan, and, you know, everywhere else, as well as in the so-called South. So I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Okay.
I'm going to interject, Soha, for a second and jump in the queue. Kim, I had to say this. You know, if you talk about globalization from below, it's such a well-recognized, well-articulated framework that fits into certain kinds of civil society modes of doing politics. And I think what Josh is after maybe is things that are practices that do not quite fit into that. So politics that make us very uncomfortable. I think Trumpism would be a good example here. I mean, one could talk of it as globalization from below or politics from below, right? But there is something more going on that's sort of uncivil. I think the under-globalization has to do with the kind of, almost it's scandalous for even liberal or progressive people sometimes.
Okay, let me take on my task as moderator again. But yeah, this is what in the same frame. Okay, Jan and then Soha. Yeah, yes.
Thanks so much, Joshua, and thanks for inviting Joshua, Bishnu, and Bhaskar. So, Joshua, it's not just your theme, but how you deal with the theme, how you approach it, that there are so many subtexts there. There are so many questions that we share. And so I just want to put them out loud a bit. Maybe the core problem is, what is the boundary between analysis and wordplay? And at a deeper level, maybe wordplay is analysis, because words are also play. And part of that is the question, can language travel? Like as Said said, can theory travel? The problem is context. We transport categories across contexts, and contexts are actually infinite, and the categories themselves change their nature. And it poses then the question, does language work? Does it work at all? And these questions have been posed from Dada to postmodernism. If we talk about the fake, it actually poses the problem or the question of the real. And we recognize, acknowledge the fluidity of the character of reality. So our rendezvous with pretending that the real is real in working with the fake, just like Rochefoucauld said, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice makes to virtue. So in talking about the fake, we are also talking about reality, the real as a joke. And to keep our sense of humor in all this, which is difficult because some of these things are deeply tragic and catastrophic. There's a fine line there. And I appreciate the way you, in the subtext of how you talk about things, you bring out these things. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure the question, but I appreciate the insight.
Neither am I.
But one pragmatic thing I'll say is that, I think one of the things that's changed in how I've thought about the project and how I've presented it is, the recognition of writing in English in North America for a particular readership, right? I think when I'm having this conversation with friends or filmmakers in China, it's not the same conversation, but the issues I want to speak to and how I want to frame them, I think, do get set up in a particular way for this audience, precisely because of what I think the norms within a lot of these debates are, right? Whether it's media studies, whether it's kind of like ICT for D or whatever it is, that there's a set of assumptions that do particular things. And so I think it's made me, it's made me just reflect a little bit more on who it is that I think I'm speaking to, as an American writing in English for an Anglophone academic audience about China and all of that. Which again is why I think I maybe even I've been told sometimes I go too far, but I'll often kind of defend pretty strongly what seem as often lame dismissals of China based in an assumption, right, that like the US or something else should be a model, right? It's that gap that I think is really fascinating and what's often missing from especially mainstream debates, right, about globalization and all the rest of it.
Very profound to global studies, these questions of language. Thanks, please.
Yes, and I know you tailored the talk very much to this audience, so that's really great. Josh, we have two other questions and we're heading toward the end of the hour. So there's Soha and then Charmaine's will be the last. Dorian, I see you. If you can hang on. I know what you want to cover, Josh, for social sciences. We can just hang on for a bit after.
Should we just hear all of the questions? I've talked a lot and then I can respond.
Okay. Yeah, Soha and then Charmaine, you want to put your questions? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Joshua. You tapped into so many of the deep questions that I'm working through, and that comes from I study Iran, and again, similarly, it's that piratical state that exceptions that defines Iran and the Islamic Republic against the global order, particularly United States. And the sort of like piratical media practices is very present there. For instance, reverse engineering an American drone and make their own things. However, the question that I have is that when I think about piratical, it always positions itself against an original. And that sort of troubles me in a way that it it sort of places what is piratical not only in relation to something else, but always derivative, which places the global north as the original. How can we tackle with that issue of something being piratical, something being derivative, without always sort of placing it as a difference, as something that is always different, as something that it is always secondary?
Charmaine, you want to add your question and then we'll hand it over to Josh?
I'll try to be brief. Thank you, Joshua. This was just brilliant and I enjoyed it so much. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the ways in which, increasing arguments around China's economic prosperity have surrounded its falling rate of profit, the encroaching crisis that we start to see with things like Evergrande, where part of what you were talking about when you indicated the kind of massive growth of a kind of state-sanctioned imaginary of these grandiose projects like the Olympic Stadium are in part for you about a kind of, national imaginary of a certain kind of citizenship, but that grandiosity also has a particular economic function in the Chinese national narrative. And in particular, the kind of ways in which infrastructure financing kind of aid, not just like an impression of China's projected modernity, but also a kind of way of thinking about and forecasting future economic growth, is something that we're starting to see China meet its limits with in sort of encroaching financial crises that are starting to manifest in ghost towns and things like that. So I guess my question is just, could you speak a little bit to how piratical citizenship might also speak to or interface with the kinds of contradictions of capitalism that we're starting to see in China? In other words, are there forms of piratical citizenship that you see, for example, through things like labor struggles that are also starting to, I suppose, peel back the ways in which this narrative of state modernity is also reaching a kind of financial contradiction?
Thank you. Those great points, and I'd love to talk to you more because you have clearly an understanding of some of the larger political economic questions that I could learn from. So maybe I'll start with yours, Charmaine, just because they're fresher in my head. But I would say most basically, and I don't know how scalable a concept like this is, or even if that's my aim, but most basically, I think it shares in that basic insight, right? So there are two things, at least I see here. On the one hand, the kind of speculative emptiness, right, that you're describing, this is also normal, right? This is New York, this is Bombay, this is not a surprising outcome from this kind of developmentalist, speculative, often short-term financial gain kind of investments, right? For usually these big corporations, who own a lot of stuff, as you're talking about. But I think what interests me is this basic question about what happens when the normative legal relationships we have between certain structures fail. I think housing ownership and that kind of dynamic clearly fits into this. And then the response seems to be, and this is both, I think, has a lot of positive potentialities, but also can be deeply reactionary, as we've seen, right, is to then draw on new kinds of legitimacies, right? So this can lead to exactly worker organization, ground level kinds of solidarities, but also it leads to like do your own research, right? And this has always been people's concern with, even Chatterjee's idea about political society, that it opens up this space of fecundity, but where like maybe the limits on it within a normative democratic, theory framework are too broad, right? If anything that constitutes a locally legitimate practice, right, can be a ground for a kind of politics, we obviously the danger's there. jump out very quickly. But that relationship, I think, is what fascinates me and does point to something like, yeah, just what does it even mean in different contexts to take that illegal relationship as the starting point rather than as the aberrant outcome, right? I think maybe just even as a method, it's just, it maybe inverts the order with which we kind of pursue these questions. And so I see them as shared in terms of the larger project and the changes. It's something I've read about, but it's not something I've tracked closely. I've been very interested in a lot of the platform economy kind of stuff as like uptakes on some of the media questions I've asked previously. And this also shares in that, right? So, I mean, I think it's related, you know, especially when we talk about like express delivery infrastructures and stuff like this, which China innovated, you know, over the last 20 years and now have finally arrived, right, and become normalized in places like North America because of the pandemic, right? So you also get these confused. Anyway, there's a lot more to say there, but I appreciate the question, and that level of, I think, economic detail, especially with regard to the real estate economy, is not something that I've treated and is a bit outside of my expertise, but it's a great question.
Thank you.
The other question, just to be very brief, so two things: the relationship between whatever the piratical aspect and the power structure, I'm okay with that being there, because in a certain sense that's the point, to draw attention to kind of the structuring force in a given field. But I think what you're missing, at least for me, is that the idea of the original of fake, that's closer to the media logic of piracy, right? Piracy has lots of other histories, including, of course, you know, going back to Roman law and maritime piracy, where the pirate is the person who does not belong to a state, right, is outside of proper society and can be killed by anyone, right? That logic still holds more or less in international law, right? You can kill terrorists because they're non-state actors. You can do things at sea precisely because they're outside of territorial bounds. And so that's a very different logic for understanding relationships between, you know, dominance and a given actor, and understanding what it is that piracy does as a legal structure, as a power structure, or as a kind of response, right? So the iterative dimension, I think, is interesting, right? And this is something that media studies can bring, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about intellectual property and media piracy and copies, but that form of copying, right? That form of being outside the law, that relationship to violence is not the same as, I think, the larger structure of the piratical within international legal frameworks. And a lot of people have written, you know, about this kind of stuff. So I mostly have learned from them. This is not anything I'm contributing, but I think that recognition of the figure of the pirate as the enemy of all, right, as the one who's outside of the municipality and the territory and all these sorts of things, that's maybe what's proliferating, right? Those kinds of forms of that, even temporary forms, right? As we start to move into virtual spaces, and you know, there's lots of ways of taking this up. So yeah, I like the question a lot, but I think I don't think we should be limited to intellectual property, to media, to kind of content or authorship questions when we're thinking about pirate relationships.
Okay, we've been exhausting you, Josh. One more question from Jiaqing, because I know he has lots of expertise in the green China part. But yeah, I'll let you do the last question, Jiaqing.
Thanks, Josh. It was a really wonderful talk. I'm disappointed we didn't get to see you in person. My question has to do with this really powerful figure and theorization that Bhaskar helped to clarify too about piratical citizenship and this outsideness that you were just discussing. I want to bring that into conversation with the last comments here about, it also goes back to the kind of top-down, bottom-up kind of thing. But your response to Charmaine here about land political economy and the kind of empty speculation. how much, to me, I think a really important aspect of that, the empty, ghost towns, the empty, not just structures, but kind of empty content of development, right? That in a sense you're describing, and this is in my own work as well, a situation in which churn and change is itself the goal, right? There's not actually a well-specified end goal, right? I mean, it's a kind of specular and phantasmagoric idea of development that is difficult to pin down, and certainly in the sense that it has a temporal, always tomorrow, and intergenerational, processual trajectory that's always kind of shifting, right? That people are sacrificing now for something for their children or even their children's children, in the face of China's massive social and spatial change. I'm wondering, how much do you see a shift in the visual culture in these forms that of kind of outside piratical citizenship, where people might be making claims to things that are absolutely legal citizenship rights, like for instance, protection of their personal property, but within a phantasmagoric conception of what the collective property is, right? That which is constitutional, that the state owns everything, and therefore dispossession as a course of development is both a part of your relationship to the state, but also leaves you outside of the normal kind of everydayness of citizenship, right? If you are being told where to live, and that what had been your historic, if you were on the edge of Beijing, for instance, in what had been rural land, and generations of kind of transformation under the party state, since collectivization and household production and so on. Sorry to ramble, but what I'm trying to get at is, like, how much does a visual culture and these practices kind of describe a shift from a notion of the citizen and the individual as parts of social mobilization for socialism, as it has been brought up, to one in which we're in this larger environment where the speculation of the self and the individual's relationship to citizenship and the state become a process that is ill-specified, that it becomes speculative on the individual level, and it becomes kind of some strange hybrid between hyper-individualistic neoliberal context of the market and also extra market forces that are totally coercive and kind of unquestionable. How do you see those kinds of tensions and processes that are clearly not mutually exclusive in China's case being expressed in these figures that you really evocatively bring to us? Thanks. Sorry if that's really unclear. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Josh. That's a beautiful question and complicated. But my first reaction is, you've just so nicely described, I think, my intuition that some of these structurings have shifted from a logic of underdevelopment to a logic of overdevelopment, right? That the way that extraction and surplus operates has itself changed in some fundamental ways. It doesn't mean that the other forms aren't still there and they don't jostle against each other and all that messiness, but that there is a shift, and it partly has to do with new techniques, right? That the state can operate, and also new technologies that we all use, and very complicated state corporate relation, all of these kinds of things. So, I haven't been able to be in China at all in the last 2 years, obviously, and which is too bad, because I had a new project and I was supposed to be there a lot. And the last time I was there was the summer before I spent in Shanghai, and I did a little bit of traveling. So that's obviously a very particular optic onto what China is. But as before, I became interested in really mundane kind of shifts and started to think about them in relationship to some of these larger questions. So these range from things like, I was very surprised to see how much the kind of socialist era sloganeering banners were back, like more than I had seen in 15 years. Like that logic of certain kind of performative claims about the legitimacy of the socialist state was just present on the street in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. And so that was fast, but also other like even really basic things like coffee shops being everywhere, right? Caffeine and labor productivity and cultures of optimization based on consumption. You know, this is the kind of stuff that I often start with, and it kind of fits with the same. So, you know, it's part of that other visual culture, but some of those more, it made me feel like some of the examples I was looking at in you know, a decade or more ago, they felt strangely anachronistic way too fast, right? And that's fascinating, right? How does a whole register of a city world from a decade become flipped so quickly, right? And become something else. So, I mean, those are the kind of things I was thinking with. I don't really have a good answer to that, other than that I do think there's an intensification and an inversion, and it has to do again with you know, techno-economic shifts that are pretty significant, you know, starting around 2005, after that period, in relationship to the internet and smart sensors and things like this. And so my intuition again then is to try to think about what gets left out of those discourses, right? So again, if in the other era there was like this dominant kind of vision that framed where we were going and why it was good, I'm interested in similar question at the same moment, right? What is the image of where we're going and why it matters, and what is clearly present in everyday experience but not being discussed in relationship to that vector, right? That's the kind of, anyways, I'm sorry we didn't get to see each other as well, and I do hope we can talk some more.
That was really pithy. Thank you.
Maybe we can remedy that, but we're way over time. So please join me in thanking Josh, not only for an amazing talk, but the depth with which you answer each question, and also sort of the generosity of interdisciplinarity. It's not easily found. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bishnu. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Bhaskar.
Thanks everybody for joining. So next week, just to let you know, we're going to be hosting Paul Bowles, who's going to be talking about pipelines in Canada's Pacific Northwest. So we'll see you guys there. Bye, everybody.